The Egyptian world during the Bronze Age was one of trade and constant warfare. It is well known that the Egyptians fought many wars with the different cultures that took up power in the Middle East and the Levant, but what many people neglect to talk about is the conflicts between the nation and the kingdom of Kush in the south, also referred to as Nubia. The kingdom of Kush was founded by a people known as the Kushites in the year 1070 BC, after the collapse of Egyptian rule in the region. The Kushites were a Nilotic people who originated in present-day Sudan, but then it was referred to as Nubia. They were a warrior people, and they quickly became a major power in the region. In the 8th century BC, the Kushites conquered Egypt and established the 25th dynasty over the country. They ruled Egypt for over 60 years, and during this time, they introduced many Kushite elements to Egyptian culture. For example, they built temples to their gods in the Egyptian style, and then in turn adopted the Egyptian writing system. There was lots of cultural diffusion between the two culture groups, and when the Kushites were thrown out of the country, they would take these cultural elements with them. The Kushite capital was Napata, which is located in present-day northern Sudan. Napata was a major center for trade and culture. In particular, the city gained renown for being a way station and gateway for trade from sub-Saharan Africa towards the Mediterranean, and most importantly, for the gold industry that was based there in the city. The city was also home to many temples, including the Temple of Amun, one of Africa's largest temples. The Kingdom of Kush had a long and complex relationship with Egypt. The two kingdoms were often at war, but traded with each other and exchanged cultural ideas. Besides worshipping some of the same gods as the Egyptians, such as Amun, the most popular and clear instance of cultural diffusion between the two groups is the Nubian pyramids. They closely resemble the pyramids in Egypt, but they are smaller and more narrow at the top. In the 7th century BC, the Kushites invaded Egypt again. This time, though, they were defeated by the Assyrians. The Assyrians drove the Kushites out of Egypt, and they ended Kushite rule over Egypt for good. The Kingdom of Kush then resisted Persian invasion in 530 BC. While the Persians led by Cambyses were able to occupy some parts of northern Kush, the kingdom held them back. The occupation of the old capital forced the relocation of the government to the city of Meroe, which, from then on, became the capital of the kingdom. Meroe flourished over the next few centuries as it became a center for Red Sea trade, iron production, ivory, and gold. I would even go so far as to say that Meroe at its height rivaled that of the other important imperial capitals of the time, such as Carthage, Rome, and Persepolis. Speaking of Rome, after the Roman conquest of Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush now bordered the Roman Empire. Relation between the two states were contentious, and even resulted in a short war, a topic that will be covered in a different video. The following peace treaty, though, between the two countries led to a 300-year peace between the two, and during that time, trade flourished. Eventually, when the situation in Rome began to deteriorate, the Kushites were able to occupy southern Egypt. The kingdom continued to grow in power until a trade dispute with the kingdom of Aksum to its south erupted into a war. Aksum, the predecessor to the modern state of Ethiopia, sent a large army that ended up sacking Meroe. The destruction that was wrought at the hands of this invading army brought the kingdom to its knees, and after a short decline, Kush fell apart into smaller warring states, and Aksum would later annex some of them. By 550 AD, the Kingdom of Kush had ceased to exist. The Kingdom of Kush left a lasting legacy. Its culture and art influenced many other cultures in Africa. Its temples and pyramids are still standing today and are a testament to the greatness of this ancient kingdom. It would truly be a tragedy not to talk about this amazing country and its dynamic with Egypt. It is a shame that we do not talk about the Kingdom of Kush in the same way that we discuss the rest of the classical world, such as Macedon or the Roman Empire. The Kushites were just as important to ancient history as the Egyptians or the Romans or the Persians. You know, a people group was amazing when they are depicted as Egyptian hieroglyphics in the pyramids of the Egyptians. Therefore, in the future, whenever you talk about the classical age, I hope that you think in the back of your mind about the amazing people that once inhabited the kingdom of Kush. The Romans and the Kushites had a long and complex relationship, marked by both conflict and trade. The first Roman interaction with the kingdom of Kush came after Egypt became part of the Roman Empire in 31 BC. The Romans attempted to exert control over the kingdom of Kush a few times, and this led to conflicts between the two states. Hostile relations first arose when the first prefect of Roman Egypt, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, launched an attack into Kush with the aim of subordinating the kingdom and turning them into a client state that paid money to the empire. After some early successes, the tides began to turn. The Kushites invaded Egypt and captured several cities. They tore down some of the statues of Julius Caesar and of Augustus. It is actually because of the looting of the latter's statues that we have one of the best artifacts from the time. The bronze head of Augustus, seen on the screen right now, is one of the best preserved artifacts and depictions of Augustus, and it was found in the ruins of Meroe. The Romans then responded by sending another army into Nubia, led by Publius Petronius. Petronius's army defeated the Kushites, led by Queen Amanirenas, and captured their capital, Napata. It was following this event that the royal families of Kush would completely move to Meroe, something that was mentioned in the previous video about the kingdom of Kush. However, the Kushites continued to resist Roman rule, and eventually, the Romans were forced to make peace. Amanirenas led the peace talks and negotiated a very favorable peace that saw Kush annex parts of southern Egypt. After the treaty, the Romans and the kingdom of Kush engaged in trade. The Kushites traded ivory and gold and other goods to the Romans, and in turn they received goods such as glass and jewelry and household furnishings. This relationship lasted for several centuries, until the 3rd century AD. While this is the main military conflict between the two, almost a second one occurred. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Emperor Nero planned to invade the kingdom of Kush, but his plans were abandoned after a group of Roman soldiers explored the region and reported back that it was mostly desert and, therefore, kind of worthless. I actually made a video about this topic a while ago, and I highly recommend you go and watch, because it covers some of the other pretty obscure Roman expeditions into Africa. The Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Kush's relationship was complex, and at first, very adversarial. However, it was also marked by trade and cultural exchange that lasted over 300 years and provided immense wealth to both countries. This only came to an end once the Kingdom of Kush fell apart due to invasions and political strife. The Romans did actually send another military expedition to fight some of the invading tribes, but that wasn't out of friendliness. That was because one of the tribes was also raiding Roman Egypt, and it just made more sense to go defeat them there than fight in Egypt. Also, during the Byzantine Empire, the nations did have contact, but by the time of Justinian, the kingdom of Kush had all but ceased to exist due to infighting and conquering, and it all fell apart. So in reality, you could just say that the Romans still had contact with the people in what is then Nubia, today's Sudan, but the kingdom really didn't exist much as a formal entity by then. In the last few videos, we discussed the history of the people who inhabited Nubia and their contact with the Romans. While all those topics are interesting, today I want to focus on the people who led the kingdom of Kush and pushed the Nubian civilization to new heights. I have picked out a few of the important rulers from this civilization, and we're going to go over them and learn about the important things that they did. Early on in the kingdom's lifespan, there were many conflicts with Egypt, and while the Nubians were usually on the losing end, or at least only able to get a draw out of a war, there were a few brief times in history where the Nubians were able to not only capture some Egyptian territory, but they were even able to rule the kingdom. The 25th dynasty of Egypt, which lasted for nearly 100 years from 744 BC to 656 BC, is entirely unique because it was one of the first times that the region had been ruled by a group of people that were not native Egyptians. For simplicity's sake, I will refer to this group as the Nubian Dynasty. The rulers of the Nubian Dynasty were a bridge that saw the Egyptianization of their home region of Nubia and some of the fusion of Nubian culture into Egypt. While both groups had already shared some common gods and cultural practices, it was during this time, and after this era, that one could truly see the shared ties between these two peoples. As I've already mentioned, the most famous piece of Nubian culture is that of the Nubian pyramids, which heavily resemble the Egyptian ones but are more narrow. This dynasty added the Temple of Amun and made it a world landmark that is still around to this day. I would like to highlight one ruler in particular though, the pharaoh Shabaka. Pictured on your screen, Shabaka was the third in line of the Kushite rulers. He gained fame and prominence because of his military triumphs. Shabaka led a successful defense of Egypt against the Neo-Assyrian Empire Sargon II, and this military victory cemented Egypt's independence in the region and halted the Neo-Assyrians from continuing westwards. Shabaka is also known for the Shabaka stone, an artifact that contains the records of ancient Egyptian writings about the dynasties that came before. While not a complete history of events, the Shabaka stone shows us what Shabaka thought was interesting and gives us clear details on moments in time that we have had small glimpses of, but we would not have as great of detail had we not recovered the stone. These stories and the history around it is also important for understanding Shabaka's mindset. By understanding what a ruler wanted preserved, we might be able to figure out what his intentions were on the throne. Moving on, we have Queen Amanirenas. And for returning viewers, you will remember Amanirenas from the previous video, where I talked about how she led a military campaign against the Romans and even came out on top, negotiating a favorable peace that set the status quo for many decades in the region. While she had a brief mention last video, Amanirenas deserves a bit more of a spotlight here. Very few kingdoms could have withstood against the might of Rome, and those that were able to were because of strong leadership. Fewer still were able to stand up to Rome and come out on top. Amanirenas was a strong leader and strong commander, so much so that the Romans wrote about her. It is no coincidence that it was because of her aptness as a ruler that so many captured Roman artifacts were found in her capital at Meroe. In a time when no one could stand up against Rome, Amanirenas did so, and with great courage. The final ruler I want to look at is Queen Amanitor. Many of y'all may recognize this name, as Amanitor is actually the leader of the Nubian civilization in the video game Civilization 6. What many people do not know, though, is why Amanitor was chosen for this game and why she is so important in the grand scheme of things. Amanitor was the last of the great Nubian builders. It was in her reign that she repaired the damages caused by the Roman wars of her predecessors, and it was here where Nubian construction projects flourished. Amanitor restored the Temple of Amun in Meroe, and also reconstructed the one in the old capital of Napata that was destroyed during the Roman invasions. It wasn't just temples, though. Amanitor built over 200 pyramids during this time. For context, when we look at old Nubia, like from the beginning of the civilization, there were 200 in total. She built 200 during her reign. An amazing feat. The quality of these pyramids also show that it was during her rule that Nubian civilization reached its golden age. Most impressively, though, in my opinion, were the creation of massive irrigation ponds all around her kingdom. These ponds would store large amounts of water that were used during the dry parts of the year to irrigate crops and provide food for her kingdom. Such massive infrastructure projects find comparison only in her Roman counterparts. In short, Amanitor may have been the greatest of all Nubian rulers. The final point I want to talk about is the role of the queen in Nubian culture. Of the three people that I mentioned, two of them were women. And I would argue that these two women were the greatest rulers of Nubia. One won a war against Rome, and the other built a civilization on top of that success. They were both so significant, in fact, that both Amanirenas and Amanitor were both probably mentioned in the Bible, a feat set aside for only the greatest or most powerful rulers of that time. Nubia stands out amongst its peers because of the fact that female rulers had just as much, if not even more, legitimacy as their male peers. Even when there were male rulers, they were typically king consorts of a queen, or had inherited a throne after a war or a bit of unrest. Because of the high frequency of female rulers and the mention of women in other places of governance and prominence, many scholars and historians have deemed ancient Nubia as a matriarchal society, something that was extremely rare for that time. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the rulers of Nubia. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day.